Hello, my name is Taylor Dawal. My partner is Sam Schliep, and this is our final presentation for our Language, Logic, and Persuasion final presentation. Today, I will be presenting our first half, and my partner Sam will be presenting the second half. In the modern era of America and other countries with Western cultural affects, it is common for certain groups to face discrimination and marginalization at the hand of others. Some examples of these disadvantaged groups may include women, LGBTQ+ communities, different ethnic groups, disabled peoples, non-Christian religious practitioners, and many, many more. There are pre-existing prejudices in some parts of the world that imprint warped ideals onto the next generation. This can reinforce the ostracization and discrimination of these diverse groups, which is unjust and creates natural obstacles and disadvantages for these people. One way that communities are attempting to combat this discrimination in Western culture is through the implementation of something called political correctness. In simpler terms, political correctness describes written or spoken language that's intentionally phrased to avoid offending or marginalizing groups identified by certain social characteristics, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, or ability. Beyond the obvious avoidance of overt slurs, political correctness also includes the avoidance of terms that reinforce preconceived negative stereotypes. So overall is the avoidance of using offensive terminology against discriminated groups. The idea was created in good faith, but there has been an outcry of critics who are opposed to the idea of political correctness, as they see it serves as a form of censorship that it violates a person's right to free speech. But the advocates of the process of political correctness argue that our perception of other people is greatly influenced by the language we hear used about them. Language, therefore, when used carelessly or maliciously, can reveal and promote our biases against various identity groups. There are arguments to be had for both sides of the spectrum, but this was a heavily discussed topic in the Monk debate in 2018. This debate included 4 panelists that shared their beliefs on the efficacy of political correctness on discrimination. The panelists on this debate included journalist Michelle Goldberg, Georgetown sociology professor Michael Eric Dyson talking about the pros of political correctness, while the panelists on the other side were clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson and British film director Stephen Fry, who argued the cons of political correctness. It is important to understand the concept of political correctness as it pertains to the Monk debate in 2018, is that serves as our primary source for understanding arguments and dissecting counterarguments for the semester. This debate included a diverse panel of participants. The pro side of the political correctness debate included Michelle Goldberg, a journalist, and a Georgetown sociology professor known as Michael Eric Dyson. The con side of the argument is delivered by clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson and British film director Stephen Fry. Interestingly enough, the pro side of the political correctness argument is represented by a black male and a white woman, while the con side of the political correctness argument is represented by 2 white males. It was likely orchestrated to be this way. However, the panelists are so much deeper than just their outward appearances. One debater we found particularly interesting in this exchange was Stephen Fry and his viewpoint on political correctness. Although a successful white male in the film industry, Fry is a member of groups that are often on the receiving end of discrimination, as he is part of both the LGBTQ+ communities and also he practices Judaism. Despite his outward appearance, he has faced discrimination throughout his life, has had slurs and stereotypes thrown his way, yet still he argues that political correctness is ineffective in combating discrimination. Stephen Fry himself is not opposed to political correctness ideals. As a matter of fact, in Fry's own words, he states, "My objection to political correctness is not that it combines so much of what I've spent a lifetime loathing and opposing. My real objection is that I don't think political correctness works. I want to get to the Golden Hill, but I don't think that's the way to get there." Fry also stated, "I may be wrong. I hope to learn that this evening. I really do think I may be wrong. I'm prepared to entertain the possibility that political correctness will bring us more tolerance and a better world, but I'm not so sure." Stephen Fry instead suggests his argument to counteract discrimination. He suggests that it is more important for people to take action against discrimination that is present as opposed to censor them. Fry states that him and others aren't particularly bothered by the use of slurs towards them, but rather the underlying treatment and sentiment that's held towards them instead. Stephen Fry doesn't believe that suppressing the language that is used to put down discriminated groups will be able to change the ideologies surrounding them, the stereotypes. Opposing parties may argue that political correctness itself is an action that is being taken to oppose discrimination, and is more of a stepping stone to combating discrimination as opposed to a grand solution. But the sentiment still holds that political correctness does little to affect the prejudices and pre-established biases that riddle communities. This can be seen when put into a more simpler standard form. When 1, political correctness aims to combat discrimination. 2, political correctness suppresses the language used against vulnerable parties. 3, discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, especially on the grounds of ethnicity, age, sex, or disability. It is not solely bound to the language that is used against vulnerable parties. 4, suppressing language does not change the underlying thoughts and prejudices. And 5, therefore, political correctness is not effective in combating discrimination on its own. This is the basis of Fry's argument. The language and the stereotypes used against marginalized people is of minimal concern when compared to the larger scope of what discrimination is. Fry appeals to the pro-political correction social justice warriors by identifying himself as a man who has been discriminated against based on his sexuality and his beliefs, and he has shared his experiences of discrimination and his opinions to enact change. This argument against political correction is much better received when coming from his experience as opposed to coming from one of the other speakers, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is also against political correction due to it conflicting with the American ideals of freedom of speech. But Jordan Peterson is a successful, straight, white male who is almost excluded from the conversation due to his position in the social hierarchy. And that concludes my half of this presentation, as I supplied context to the political correctness debate, highlighted Stephen Fry's arguments, as well as put it in standard form to provide context to his experiences. Sam will be conducting the second half of this presentation.
Hello class, my name's Sam. I'm working with my partner Taylor again. He did the first half of this presentation, putting our argument into standard form, explaining the premises and the conclusion. I will be doing the second half of our presentation. I'm going to be evaluating and analyzing the argument, as well as finding some counter arguments from other debaters, analyzing those, and then giving a conclusion on whether the argument that we picked is effective or not. And the debater and the argument that we picked was Stephen Fry's, who's an English actor and journalist. And we thought that he had a unique perspective because although he's arguing against political correctness for the cons of political correctness, he has a unique perspective because he's also part of those marginalized groups that are often a part of the fight for political correctness. So he has a unique perspective being on the opposite side of it while also being included in those groups. And just for some background, his initial opening arguments, he spoke about political correctness being a zero-sum game because nobody wants to hear what the other person has to say, and it's not effective. And he feels like it's not effective because it's a failure, one of the greatest human failings, he says, to prefer to be right rather than effective. And so he doesn't agree with that, and doesn't agree with the premise of I'm offended on behalf of others. And being gay and Jewish, he also feels that like he doesn't like to be called the derogatory terms and names, but he also doesn't feel like the advances that are responsible for him to be able to be gay and married and have the things that he has now, or the rights that he has now, are the result of advances in political correctness. He does not feel that way. and he feels like it falls more along the lines of human decency, and that it is more about how they are treated and less about what they call him. Excuse me. He also feels that the problems between the left and right and the political correctness, um, that it's not a reflection of the triumphs of the right, that it's a failure of the left to be effective and to fight for it in the right way. And that if they do want to fight it, that using political correctness isn't the correct way to go about it, that they shouldn't be using political correctness and language and channels of education to fight their fight, that they should be using the proper ways through our democracy and using that to fight it rather than just using political correctness, because he feels that as people fighting for political correctness, they are not doing it in an effective way. Instead, they're just turning themselves into recruiting sergeants, as he says, for the right, because all they're doing is antagonizing and annoying people instead of actually persuading or fighting in an effective manner. And that political correctness is a middle ground. So he's saying if you're going to fight it, fight it. Do not beat around the bush in a way, using language and the way people speak. Focus on the things that should matter and go about it in the ways that are going to be effective, using our democracy in the way it was intended to be. On the other side, we have Michelle Goldberg and Michael Eric Dyson. They're fighting for the pros of political correctness. And Michelle is saying that groups are fighting for the rights of the individual members, and that they don't want to be held accountable and put in a box for the stereotypes or the feelings about one group about another, and that they need to have rights as individuals, and that's why they fight in that manner. And that it's people bonding together over a common identity in order to fight, rather than just going about it in an individual manner. And it's an argument against categorization. So putting people in groups, putting people in boxes, and then just writing them off as all being the same. And Michael's counter argument specifically to Stephen's comments and his feelings, specifically about his portion where he talks about political correctness being an ineffective middle ground, and that you need to resist it and fight it in the right way, rather than using that. His argument is that people in marginalized groups that are discriminated against and are fighting for their rights and their voice, that they may not have the means, they don't have the same means to approach it, and that they are simply using the weapons at hand. And kind of falling under the premise, with the group identities, that everyone is not guilty, but everyone is responsible. So with political correctness being everyone's responsibility to, while they may not be guilty of it or some of the wrongs, that by being politically correct and fighting and taking their part in that they are responsible for doing that. And that they are not permitted to be seen as an individual, because people only see them through that group categorized marginalization of some of those groups. And that if you don't that you're not treating the person as an individual, that you're only treating them according to the group dynamic. So he's arguing that political correctness is a fight against the categorization of individuals, so that it has to be looked at as a group dynamic. And that's why the groups are fighting for the rights. They're fighting for the group's right and not looking at it as an individual problem, and why they think political correctness is such a huge part of that. The discriminatory remarks and terms and stuff like that against certain groups, that is a huge part of that group identity, and that the way people look at these groups causes them not to be able to be individuals and be seen as that. Whereas Jordan and Stephen are arguing that it should be an individual's responsibility, and that they should be looking at each person as an individual rather than as a group, and that with an individual, they can be held responsible for their actions, for their individual actions, and a group gets dangerous because uh, how do you hold a group accountable? Where is a group responsibility to that? And so that's where they feel like political correctness could be a dangerous argument and a dangerous thing, because it can cause these groups to push notions of um, one race being better than another, or stuff like that, and that stuff, that kind of thinking, can be very dangerous versus approaching it on an individual level. And we feel that Stephen's argument is more effective, because he's arguing that while those things may be true, and while none of the things that happen are right, that fighting for political correctness isn't the correct way to go about it, because it's not effective, and it doesn't effectively argue and change things. It only incites people to be upset and annoyed. Um, so, in conclusion, I think that we both agree that it's more of a battle for politics versus political correctness, and that by fighting it in that direction, it should be done through more effective means, through the government, um, voices like that, versus like the cancel culture, where if you say something wrong, not wrong, but outside of the accepted terms or phrases, stuff that used to be allowed that no longer isn't, stuff like that only incites people to be more against it, and to be less open-minded, to be more annoyed. It causes that tension between the two groups, where neither side wants to hear each other. Neither side wants to listen to what the other person wants to say. They just write it off because they automatically are upset because they're being told how to speak, what's right, what's wrong, versus fighting for the things that actually matter, for the rights of the individual, and approaching it in an individual discussion. So Stephen and Jordan are very much advocating that political correctness is a threat to it's a threat to the progress of the marginalized groups, and it does nothing in order to help them further that progress and fight for what they believe in. So they don't disagree with how they feel, or that these issues need to be addressed. They disagree that political correctness is the proper way to go about it, and the proper way to approach that situation, that there is more effective ways to approach it. That is it for our presentation. Thank you guys so much. I hope you guys had a great semester.